The rain hammered against the windows of the Tennessee State Archives building in Nashville as Dr. Sarah Mitchell carefully unrolled the fragile photograph onto the conservation table. It was a Thursday afternoon in October 2023, and the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a clinical glow over the 19th century image that had arrived that morning from an estate sale in Knoxville. The photograph, sepia-toned and remarkably well-preserved for its age, showed a prosperous-looking barn in what appeared to be rural Hawkins County, dated 1881 on the back in faded ink. Sarah had been working as a photographic archivist for nearly 15 years, and she had developed an almost instinctive ability to read historical images like others read books. Every detail told a story. The architecture revealed economic status, the clothing indicated social class, the positioning of subjects suggested family dynamics. This particular photograph had been catalogued simply as Whitmore Farm, Spring 1881, with a notation that it had belonged to the Whitmore family for generations before being sold off with other estate items. The image itself appeared unremarkable at first glance. A large wooden barn dominated the frame, its weathered planks speaking to years of Tennessee summers and winters. In the foreground stood what appeared to be the family, a stern-looking man in his 50s wearing a dark suit and bowler hat, a woman in a high-necked dress with her hair pulled severely back, and 3 children ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14. They all stared directly at the camera with the rigid, unsmiling expressions common to photography of that era, when exposure times required subjects to remain absolutely still for several seconds. Sarah began her standard documentation process, measuring the photograph's dimensions, noting the type of paper used, examining the edges for mounting marks. She pulled out her magnifying glass to inspect the finer details, looking for any annotations, damage, or unique characteristics that would help establish provenance and historical context. The barn showed signs of recent construction or repair, with some boards appearing newer than others. A wagon wheel leaned against the structure's side. Chickens pecked at the ground near the family's feet. As Sarah moved her magnifying glass across the upper portion of the image, examining the barn's roofline, something caught her attention. In the hayloft opening, partially obscured by shadow and easily dismissed as a trick of light or a hanging tool, there appeared to be something unusual. She adjusted her desk lamp, angling it to reduce glare, and leaned closer. Her pulse quickened slightly as the shape began to resolve itself into something more distinct. It was a face. A human face, partially hidden in the darkness of the hayloft, but unmistakably present once noticed. The figure appeared to be watching the family below, and unlike the posed subjects in the foreground, this person had moved during the exposure, creating a slightly blurred but deeply unsettling presence. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the comfortable temperature of the climate-controlled archive room. She had seen thousands of historical photographs, but something about this hidden figure felt profoundly wrong. Sarah immediately reached for her high-resolution scanner, carefully positioning the photograph for detailed digital capture. She needed to see this more clearly, to confirm what her eyes were telling her. As the scanner hummed to life and the bright light passed slowly over the image, she felt a familiar mixture of excitement and unease that came with significant historical discoveries. This was no longer just another routine cataloging job. This was something that could change the entire context of the photograph, potentially revealing a dark chapter of Tennessee history that had remained hidden for over a century. The digital file appeared on her computer screen moments later, and Sarah immediately zoomed in on the hayloft area. The enhanced resolution removed any doubt. A man's face stared out from the shadows, his features partially obscured but clearly visible. His eyes were wide, his expression difficult to read but certainly not one of casual observation. Most troublingly, there appeared to be something around his neck or upper body, though the darkness and blur of movement made it impossible to determine exactly what without further analysis. Sarah saved the file and sat back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. Could this be a hired hand or family member who had been inadvertently captured in the frame? But that didn't explain the hiding position or the apparent distress in the partial expression she could make out. The formal nature of the portrait, with the family in their best clothes positioned carefully in front of their barn, suggested this was a planned and important photograph, likely expensive and meant to commemorate something significant. No photographer of that era would have allowed an unintended figure to remain in the frame, and any family member would have been included in the formal grouping. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set outside, casting long shadows across the archive room. Sarah glanced at the clock and realized she had been examining this single photograph for over 2 hours. Her colleagues had already left for the day, and the building had taken on the particular quiet that comes to institutional spaces after hours. She should probably go home, but the mystery of the figure in the hayloft had gripped her completely. She needed to know more about the Whitmore family, about Hawkins County in 1881, about what could possibly explain this disturbing hidden presence. Sarah pulled up the Digital Tennessee Historical Society database on her computer and began searching for any information about the Whitmore family. The name was common enough that dozens of entries appeared, but she narrowed her search to Hawkins County in the 1880s. Several census records appeared, along with land deeds, birth certificates, and death records. She clicked on a promising entry, the 1880 census for Hawkins County, which listed a James Whitmore, age 52, farmer, living with his wife Martha, age 47, and their 3 children, Robert, 14, Elizabeth, 11, and Mary, 7. The ages roughly matched the children in the photograph. Further searching revealed that James Whitmore had been a moderately successful tobacco farmer who owned approximately 200 acres of land along the Holston River. Property records showed he had purchased additional land in 1879 and had taken out a loan to construct a new barn in early 1881. This aligned perfectly with the photograph, which appeared to show a relatively new structure. Everything about the Whitmore family seemed ordinary, prosperous even by rural Tennessee standards of the time. They attended the local Methodist church, paid their taxes, and by all accounts were respected members of their community. But Sarah's years of archival work had taught her that official records often told only part of the story, especially in the rural South during the post-Reconstruction era. The 1880s in Tennessee were a complex and often violent time, with lingering tensions from the Civil War, the collapse of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow laws, and ongoing economic struggles following the war's devastation. Labor disputes were common, racial violence was tragically frequent, and many dark chapters of that era went undocumented or were deliberately erased from official records. Sarah decided to expand her search, looking for any newspaper accounts from Hawkins County in 1881 that might mention the Whitmore family. The Tennessee State Archives had an extensive collection of digitized newspapers from that period, though many rural publications had been lost to time. She found several issues of the Rogersville Gazette, the county seat's newspaper, and began scrolling through the scanned pages, looking for any mention of the Whitmores or any significant events from the spring of 1881. Most of the news was mundane: agricultural reports, church socials, advertisements for farm equipment and patent medicines, brief mentions of local marriages and deaths. Then, on a page dated May 17, 1881, Sarah found something that made her breath catch. A small item, buried among other local news, reported that a Negro farmhand named Thomas Jenkins, approximately 30 years old, had absconded from his employment at a local farm and was being sought by authorities. The article provided few details but noted that Jenkins had been working under contract and that his departure had caused considerable disruption to spring planting. The article did not specify which farm Jenkins had been working on, but Sarah's instincts told her this might be connected. The timing was right, occurring just weeks before the photograph would have been taken based on the spring 1881 notation. She continued searching and found a follow-up article dated June 3, 1881, which briefly mentioned that Jenkins had been apprehended and returned to fulfill his obligations. The tone of the article was matter-of-fact, presenting the situation as a simple case of labor contract enforcement, but Sarah knew that in the post-emancipation South, such contracts were often little more than slavery by another name, with black workers trapped in cycles of debt and legal coercion. As Sarah sat in the dimming light of the archive room, staring at the photograph on her screen with the hidden figure in the hayloft, a horrifying possibility began to form in her mind. What if Thomas Jenkins had not absconded voluntarily? What if he had been trying to escape conditions that were unbearable? And what if the photograph, taken to commemorate the Whitmore family's prosperity and their new barn, had inadvertently captured something the family never intended anyone to see. The expression on the hidden man's face, the way he appeared to be partially concealed in the shadows, the timing of the photograph coinciding with Jenkins's reported capture, it all suggested a narrative far darker than the peaceful agricultural scene the photograph was meant to portray. Sarah felt a responsibility weighing on her, the same responsibility she felt every time she encountered evidence of historical injustice in the archives. These were not just interesting academic mysteries. They were human stories, often tragic ones, and bringing them to light mattered. She made a decision then, sitting alone in the quiet archive room as darkness fell completely outside. She would investigate this thoroughly, would trace every lead, would find out who the man in the hayloft was and what had happened to him. She would contact colleagues at universities, reach out to local historical societies in Hawkins County, examine every piece of evidence she could find. This photograph had revealed a secret that had remained hidden for over 140 years, and Sarah was determined to tell the full story, no matter how difficult or disturbing it might be. The following morning, Sarah arrived at the archives before dawn, unable to sleep after the previous day's discovery. The security guard looked surprised to see her so early but waved her through with a friendly nod. Sarah had always been dedicated to her work, but this felt different. The face in the hayloft had haunted her dreams, and she woke with an urgency she had rarely felt before. She carried a large travel mug of coffee and her laptop bag, prepared for a long day of intensive research. She immediately set up in her office, pulling up everything she had gathered the previous evening on multiple screens. The high-resolution scan of the photograph dominated one monitor, the hayloft figure visible even from across the room now that she knew to look for it. On another screen, she opened the census records and newspaper articles she had found. A third screen displayed a map of Hawkins County from the 1880s, showing property boundaries and the locations of various farms along the Holston River Valley. Sarah's first task was to definitively connect Thomas Jenkins to the Whitmore farm. She needed more than coincidental timing. She began by pulling every available record related to Jenkins. The 1880 census listed several men with that name in East Tennessee, but only one in Hawkins County. Thomas Jenkins, age 29, listed as a farm laborer living in what appeared to be a boarding house or workers' quarters. No family was listed with him, and his birthplace was recorded as Georgia, suggesting he may have migrated to Tennessee seeking work after the collapse of Reconstruction in his home state. Sarah then turned her attention to property records and legal documents from Hawkins County in 1880 and 1881. Courthouses in Tennessee had maintained relatively good records even during the turbulent post-war years, and many had been digitized. She spent hours scrolling through deed books, mortgage records, and civil case filings. Finally, buried in a ledger of labor contracts and obligations, she found what she was looking for: a contract dated September 1880 between James Whitmore and Thomas Jenkins, wherein Jenkins agreed to work on Whitmore's farm for a period of 2 years in exchange for wages, room, and board. The contract was standard for the era but deeply problematic by modern standards. Jenkins would receive $12 per month, paid quarterly, but the contract included clauses for fines and penalties for unsatisfactory work, insubordination, or abandonment of duties. These penalties could be deducted from wages, and the contract specified that if Jenkins left before the 2-year term was complete, he would owe Whitmore the full amount of any outstanding debt plus damages. It was a system designed to trap workers, particularly black workers who had few legal protections and limited economic options in the post-Reconstruction South. The contract confirmed Sarah's suspicion. Thomas Jenkins had been working on the Whitmore farm during the spring of 1881 when the photograph was taken. The newspaper reports of his absconding and subsequent apprehension now took on a more sinister meaning. If Jenkins had been trying to escape exploitative conditions, his recapture would have been legally sanctioned under the contract system, enforced by local authorities who had every incentive to support property owners like Whitmore. Sarah sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. The archive had begun to fill with her colleagues, the sounds of morning routines echoing through the halls. She glanced at the clock and was surprised to see it was already 9:30. She had been working for over 4 hours straight. She needed to expand her search to find out what happened to Thomas Jenkins after the photograph was taken, and most critically, to understand what the photograph itself was actually capturing in that moment. She decided to contact Dr. Marcus Chin, a colleague at the University of Tennessee who specialized in post-Civil War Southern labor history. Marcus had published extensively on convict leasing, sharecropping, and the various systems of coerced labor that had emerged after emancipation. If anyone could help her understand the broader context of Jenkins's situation, it would be Marcus. Sarah composed a detailed email, attaching the high-resolution scan and explaining what she had discovered so far. She emphasized the potential historical significance and asked if Marcus might have time to discuss the case. While waiting for a response, Sarah turned her attention to finding more information about what happened after the photograph was taken. She searched through Hawkins County court records for any cases involving Jenkins or Whitmore in the summer and fall of 1881. Criminal court records from that era were often sparse, especially for cases involving black defendants, but she had to try. After another hour of searching, she found something that made her stomach drop. A coroner's inquest dated August 14, 1881, regarding the death of a Negro male, approximately 30 years of age, identified as Thomas Jenkins. The inquest record was brief and clinical in its language, but the details were devastating. Jenkins's body had been discovered in a ravine approximately 3 miles from the Whitmore farm. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, though the coroner's notes mentioned injuries consistent with a fall and indicated that Jenkins had been in the water for several days before discovery. The inquest concluded that Jenkins had likely been intoxicated and had fallen from a height, striking his head before entering the water. No witnesses were called, and the inquiry was closed within a single day. Jenkins was buried in an unmarked grave in the County Paupers Cemetery. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she read the cold, bureaucratic language describing what was almost certainly a tragic and possibly criminal death. The official narrative was clear. A careless black laborer, probably drunk, had met with an unfortunate accident. No investigation was warranted, no one was held accountable, and Jenkins disappeared from the historical record as quietly as he had likely lived. But Sarah knew that official narratives, especially from that era and especially regarding black victims, often obscured more than they revealed. She began searching for any additional information about the circumstances of Jenkins's death. Were there any newspaper accounts? Any statements from potential witnesses? Any indication that the death had been questioned at all? She found only a single brief mention in the Rogersville Gazette, dated August 18, 1881, which repeated the coroner's findings and noted that the deceased had been employed at various farms in the area and had been known to the local authorities as a troublesome individual who frequently violated the terms of his employment. The characterization of Jenkins as troublesome was telling. Sarah had seen this pattern before in historical records. When black workers resisted exploitative conditions, when they demanded their legal rights or attempted to leave abusive situations, they were labeled as problems, as criminals, as threats to social order. The system was designed to criminalize resistance and to protect the interests of property owners. Jenkins's death, officially an accident, may well have been the result of violence, perhaps an escape attempt gone wrong, perhaps punishment for his earlier attempt to leave the Whitmore farm. Sarah's email notification chimed, breaking her concentration. Marcus had responded quickly, expressing fascination with the discovery and asking if he could come to Nashville to examine the photograph in person. He was free that afternoon and could drive down from Knoxville if Sarah was available. She immediately replied in the affirmative, relieved to have an expert collaborator. This investigation was becoming more complex and emotionally taxing than she had anticipated, and she welcomed the perspective and expertise Marcus would bring. While waiting for Marcus to arrive, Sarah decided to do something she had been avoiding: examine the photograph more closely, specifically the body language and expressions of the Whitmore family. She had been so focused on the figure in the hayloft and the historical records that she had not carefully analyzed the family themselves. She zoomed in on each face, studying their expressions with her trained eye. James Whitmore stood at the center of the family grouping, one hand resting on his son's shoulder, the other holding what appeared to be a Bible or ledger book. His expression was stern, almost defiant, with a slight hardness around the eyes that suggested he was not a gentle man. Martha Whitmore stood slightly behind her husband, her face drawn and tired, her eyes not quite meeting the camera. There was something resigned in her posture, as if she carried a great weight. The children were more difficult to read. The oldest boy, Robert, looked uncomfortable, his shoulders tense, his gaze directed slightly away from the camera. The two girls, Elizabeth and Mary, both wore expressions of solemn compliance, the kind of careful neutrality children learn when they live in households where emotions must be carefully managed. None of them smiled, but that was typical for photographs of the era. What struck Sarah was the overall sense of tension in the family grouping, a quality she had not initially noticed but which now seemed obvious. Sarah pulled back from the screen and considered what the photograph was really showing. Here was a family portrait, meant to commemorate prosperity and success, taken in front of a newly constructed barn that represented significant investment and economic advancement. But hidden in the hayloft above them was a man whose presence suggested something far darker. Possibly a prisoner, possibly someone being concealed, possibly someone whose fate was already sealed when the photograph was taken. The juxtaposition was chilling, the formal presentation of respectable agricultural success literally overshadowing a human being in distress. Marcus arrived at 2 o'clock, bringing with him an energy and enthusiasm that Sarah found both comforting and appropriate to the gravity of their discovery. He was a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a worn leather messenger bag stuffed with books and papers. They greeted each other with the easy familiarity of colleagues who had worked together before, and Sarah immediately led him to her office to show him the photograph. Marcus studied the image in silence for several minutes, occasionally zooming in and out, adjusting the contrast and brightness to see details more clearly. Finally, he sat back and removed his glasses, cleaning them absently as he often did when deep in thought. His expression was troubled but not surprised. He told Sarah that what she had discovered was both extraordinary and tragically consistent with patterns he had documented extensively in his research. Marcus explained that the period from 1877 to the early 1900s represented what he called the nadir of American race relations, the lowest point in the post-emancipation era. After federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, ending Reconstruction, Southern states rapidly implemented systems designed to restore as much of the antebellum social and economic order as possible. Labor contracts like the one Jenkins had signed were one mechanism, but there were many others. Vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployment, allowing police to arrest black men and lease them to farms and businesses, debt peonage that trapped workers in permanent servitude, and extra-legal violence that enforced compliance and punished resistance. In Tennessee specifically, Marcus said, the 1880s saw a dramatic increase in labor disputes and violence related to agricultural work. The state's economy was still recovering from the devastation of the Civil War, and landowners were desperate to maintain cheap, controllable labor forces. Black workers who tried to leave exploitative situations, who demanded better conditions, or who simply asserted their legal rights as free citizens often faced severe consequences. Some were returned to their employers by force, some were arrested on trumped-up charges, and some simply disappeared. Marcus then shared something that gave both of them chills. He had documented multiple cases from the 1880s where black laborers who attempted to escape or who resisted their working conditions were confined in barns, outbuildings, or other structures on farms. In some cases, this was temporary punishment before the worker was returned to labor. In other cases, the confinement ended in death, either through neglect, violence, or staged accidents. The official records rarely told the full story, but oral histories, letters, and occasional newspaper accounts that slipped through the usual censorship provided glimpses of a widespread pattern of abuse. The photograph, Marcus suggested, might be capturing one of these moments. If Jenkins had attempted to leave the Whitmore farm in May, as the newspaper indicated, and had been apprehended and returned in early June, it was entirely possible that he was being held somewhere on the property. The new barn, with its secure hayloft, would have been an ideal location. The timing of the photograph in spring 1881, likely taken in June or early July based on the vegetation and clothing visible in the image, meant that Jenkins might have been confined in that very hayloft when the photographer arrived to take the commemorative family portrait. Sarah asked the question that had been troubling her most. Did the photographer know? Did whoever took this picture realize there was a man in the hayloft, or had Jenkins moved into view during the long exposure, creating this accidental documentation of his imprisonment? Marcus thought for a moment before responding. He said that photographers in that era were typically itinerant professionals who traveled from farm to farm, offering their services. They would have been focused on technical aspects, lighting, composition, exposure time, and might not have noticed a figure partially obscured in shadow, especially if their attention was on the posed family in the foreground. But it was also possible, Marcus admitted, that the photographer did notice and chose to say nothing, either out of fear or complicity. The two researchers spent the rest of the afternoon going through all the documentation Sarah had gathered, with Marcus providing historical context and suggesting additional avenues of investigation. He recommended reaching out to local historians and genealogists in Hawkins County who might have access to private family papers, church records, or oral histories that never made it into official archives. He also suggested contacting the descendants of the Whitmore family, if any could be located, though both acknowledged this would be delicate and potentially contentious. As evening approached and the archive prepared to close, Sarah and Marcus made plans to collaborate on a more formal investigation. Marcus offered to write to contacts he had in Tennessee historical societies and to search his own extensive research files for any additional information about James Whitmore or labor conditions in Hawkins County during the 1880s. Sarah would continue working through the archives, looking for any additional photographs, letters, or documents related to the Whitmore family or Thomas Jenkins. They also discussed the ethical dimensions of what they were doing. Jenkins had no known descendants, no one to speak for him or to claim his story. He had died alone, buried in an unmarked grave, his life reduced to a few lines in impersonal records. By bringing his story to light, by examining the photograph that had accidentally captured evidence of his imprisonment and possibly the last weeks of his life, Sarah and Marcus were taking on a responsibility to tell his story accurately, respectfully, and completely. They owed it to Jenkins and to the countless others like him whose suffering had been erased from official histories. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Marcus's investigation expanded in multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah divided her time between the archives and field research, traveling to Hawkins County to examine records in person and to speak with local historians. Marcus worked his academic networks, reaching out to specialists in photographic analysis, legal historians, and experts on post-Reconstruction violence. Together, they began to piece together a more complete picture of what had happened in the spring and summer of 1881, and of the broader context that made Jenkins's fate not just possible but tragically common. Sarah's first trip to Hawkins County took place on a crisp November morning. The drive from Nashville took about 5 hours, winding through the beautiful Tennessee countryside as autumn colors blazed across the hillsides. The county seat, Rogersville, was a small town that retained much of its 19th-century character, with historic buildings clustered around a traditional courthouse square. Sarah had arranged to meet with Betty and Crawford, the volunteer director of the Hawkins County Historical Society, who had been collecting local history materials for over 30 years. Betty was a woman in her late 70s, sharp-minded and passionate about preserving the county's past, though Sarah quickly realized that like many local historical societies, the focus had traditionally been on celebrating prosperous families and glossing over uncomfortable truths. When Sarah explained the nature of her research and showed Betty and the photograph, the older woman's expression shifted from pleasant interest to visible discomfort. She admitted that the Whitmore family was well documented in the county's historical materials, always presented as upstanding citizens and successful farmers, but she had never heard anything about Thomas Jenkins or any trouble at the farm. Betty led Sarah to the Historical Society's archives, housed in a converted Victorian house filled with filing cabinets, boxes of photographs, and shelves of old books and papers. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Whitmore Family and spread its contents across a large table. There were numerous photographs of various Whitmore family members spanning several generations, property deeds, newspaper clippings about crop yields and church activities, and a family genealogy painstakingly compiled by a descendant in the 1960s. Sarah spent hours going through the materials, photographing relevant documents with Betty Ann's permission. Several additional photographs of the Whitmore farm appeared in the collection, taken at various dates from the 1880s through the early 1900s. The barn was visible in many of them, aging gradually over the decades. One photograph, dated 1895, showed the barn partially collapsed, apparently from storm damage. Another from 1901 showed it rebuilt in a slightly different configuration. But none of the other photographs contained anything like the hidden figure Sarah had discovered in the 1881 image. Betty Ann reluctantly shared some information that did not appear in the official historical materials. She said that in the 1970s, when she was first becoming involved in local history work, an elderly African-American woman named Josephine Turner had approached the Historical Society with stories her grandmother had told her about conditions on various farms in the county during the 1880s. The stories described brutal treatment of black workers, including beatings, false imprisonments, and suspicious deaths. Betty Ann admitted, with evident shame, that the Historical Society's board at the time had dismissed the stories as exaggerations or misunderstandings, focusing instead on preserving the heritage of prominent white families. Josephine Turner had been hurt by the rejection and never returned. She had passed away in 1982, and whatever knowledge she possessed had died with her. Sarah asked if there were any descendants of Josephine Turner who might have inherited family stories or documents. Betty Ann thought there might be a great-grandson living in Kingsport, about 30 miles away, but she did not have contact information. Sarah made a note to track him down, recognizing that oral histories from the black community might contain crucial information that never made it into official white-controlled archives. Before leaving Rogersville, Sarah drove out to the location where the Whitmore farm had been. Using the historical maps she had studied and GPS coordinates she had calculated, she found the site along a quiet rural road near the Holston River. The farm was long gone, the land divided and sold off decades earlier. A modern subdivision now occupied part of the former property, with neat houses on half-acre lots. But some of the land remained undeveloped, covered in trees and undergrowth. Sarah walked the perimeter, trying to imagine what the place had looked like in 1881, trying to feel some connection to the events that had occurred there. She found the site of where the barn had likely stood, now just a slight depression in the earth and some old foundation stones barely visible through the vegetation. Standing there in the late afternoon light, Sarah felt the weight of what she was investigating. This had been a real place where real people lived and worked and suffered. Thomas Jenkins had stood here, had worked this land, had been imprisoned in a structure that no longer existed, and had died nearby under circumstances that were never properly investigated. The peaceful suburban landscape around her seemed to mock the violence and tragedy that had occurred on this very ground. Back in Nashville, Marcus had been making his own progress. He had located trial transcripts from several cases in East Tennessee during the 1880s involving disputes between black laborers and white landowners. The pattern was consistent. Black workers who attempted to leave employment contracts were invariably found in violation of the law and either forced to return to work or sentenced to labor in the county chain gang or convict lease system. White landowners were never found at fault, even in cases where there was clear evidence of physical abuse or contract violations on the employer's part. Marcus had also consulted with Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic historian at Vanderbilt University who specialized in analyzing historical photographs for evidence of crime or violence. Patricia examined the high-resolution scan of the Whitmore barn photograph with professional scrutiny, using specialized software to enhance details and analyze the image at a pixel level. Her findings were both technically impressive and deeply disturbing. Patricia confirmed that the figure in the hayloft was definitely a human being, and based on the proportions and positioning, was most likely a man in his 20s or 30s. The slight blur suggested movement during the exposure, which typically lasted between 5 and 15 seconds for outdoor photographs in that era. This movement could indicate that the person was trying to stay hidden but had shifted position, possibly hoping to be seen or documented. Most significantly, Patricia identified what appeared to be restraints around the figure's upper body or arms, though she cautioned that the poor lighting and blur made absolute certainty impossible. Patricia also noted something that Sarah had not initially observed. subtle differences in the facial expressions of the Whitmore family members that might indicate awareness of the figure above them. James Whitmore's slight upward tilt of the head, almost imperceptible unless one was looking for it, suggested he might have been conscious of activity in the loft. Martha Whitmore's tense posture and her positioning slightly behind her husband could indicate fear or discomfort with the situation. These were interpretations rather than definitive conclusions, but they suggested that the family was at minimum aware of Jenkins's presence, if not actively participating in his confinement. Sarah and Marcus met again in mid-November to compare their findings and plan their next steps. They now had substantial evidence that Thomas Jenkins had been held at the Whitmore farm, that he had been photographed while confined in the barn's hayloft, and that he had died under suspicious circumstances a few weeks later. But they still lacked direct evidence linking his death to James Whitmore or proving that the death was anything other than the accident the coroner had ruled it to be. Marcus suggested they try to locate the actual site where Jenkins's body had been found. The coroner's report mentioned a ravine approximately 3 miles from the Whitmore property, and Marcus had found a geological survey map from the 1880s that showed several such ravines in the area. If they could identify the specific location, there might be additional information to be gathered, though both acknowledged that after nearly a century and a half, the chances of finding physical evidence were virtually zero. Sarah had better news to share. She had successfully tracked down Michael Turner, the great-grandson of Josephine Turner, the woman who had tried to share her grandmother's stories with the Historical Society in the 1970s. Michael lived in Kingsport and worked as a high school history teacher. When Sarah called him and explained her research, he had been immediately interested and eager to help. His great-great-grandmother, he explained, had been born into slavery in Georgia and had come to Tennessee after emancipation seeking work and a better life. She had lived to be 96 years old and had passed down detailed family histories and stories from her years working on various farms in East Tennessee. Michael invited Sarah to visit him the following weekend, promising to share everything he knew. He mentioned that his great-great-grandmother had specifically talked about a man who had disappeared from a farm in Hawkins County in the early 1880s, and that the family had always believed he had been murdered, though no one was ever held accountable. Michael said his great-great-grandmother had been deeply traumatized by the incident and by the general conditions black workers faced during that era, and she had made sure her descendants understood this history, even when the broader white community wanted to forget or deny it. The weekend visit to Michael Turner's home proved to be one of the most significant breakthroughs in the investigation. Michael's house in Kingsport was warm and welcoming, filled with family photographs and African-American cultural artifacts. He had prepared extensively for Sarah's visit, pulling out boxes of family materials that had been preserved across multiple generations. Among these materials were several handwritten notebooks containing the oral histories his great-great-grandmother had dictated to family members in the 1930s when she was in her 80s. Sarah sat at Michael's dining room table, carefully reading through the notebooks while Michael provided context and answered questions. The relevant section appeared in a notebook dated 1937, in which Michael's great-great-grandmother, referred to throughout as Grandma Rose, described her years working on Tennessee farms. The handwriting was careful and clear, suggesting the family had recognized these stories' importance and wanted to preserve them accurately for future generations. Grandma Rose described working briefly on the Whitmore farm in late 1880 as a cook and domestic worker. She said James Whitmore was a hard man who treated his black workers with cruelty, paying them as little as possible and finding excuses to impose fines and penalties that kept them perpetually in debt. She mentioned that his wife Martha seemed afraid of him and that the children were quiet and obedient in that way that suggested a strict, possibly violent household. Grandma Rose had left the employment after only a few months, forfeiting wages she was owed rather than continue working in that environment. The notebook continued with Grandma Rose's account of what she heard in the summer of 1881 from other black workers in the area. A young man named Thomas or Tom, she was not certain of his last name, had been working on the Whitmore farm under contract. He had tried to leave because Whitmore was beating him and withholding wages, but he had been caught and brought back by the sheriff. After that, no one saw him working in the fields anymore, and rumors circulated that he was being kept in the barn, locked up as punishment and warning to other workers who might think about leaving their contracts. Then one day in August, Grandma Rose wrote, Thomas's body was found in a ravine, supposedly drowned. The white authorities said it was an accident, that he had been drunk and fallen. But everyone in the black community knew the truth was different. Several people had heard screams coming from the Whitmore property in the days before Thomas disappeared. One man, who Grandma Rose did not name but described as someone who had briefly worked as a hired hand on a neighboring farm, claimed he had seen Thomas being dragged from the barn by James Whitmore and another white man late one night. The next day, Thomas was dead. Grandma Rose's account ended with a statement that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read it. "They killed that boy sure as the world. Worked him half to death, beat him when he tried to leave, locked him up like an animal, and then when he still would not break, they killed him and threw him in the water. The white law did not care nothing about it. We had no voice then, no way to make them listen. But I want my children and grandchildren to know this happened, to remember that boy's name was Thomas and he deserved better. We all deserved better." Sarah looked up from the notebook to find Michael watching her with an expression of sadness and determination. He said his family had carried this story for generations, along with many others like it, because they understood that official history rarely told the truth about what black people had endured. His great-great-grandmother had made her descendants promise to preserve these accounts, to never let the suffering be forgotten even if the wider world refused to acknowledge it. Michael said that when Sarah had called describing her research and the photograph, he had immediately thought of the story about Thomas and hoped it might finally bring some form of justice or at least recognition. Sarah asked if Michael would be willing to let her photograph the notebooks and to potentially use Grandma Rose's testimony as part of a formal historical documentation. Michael agreed enthusiastically, saying this was exactly what his great-great-grandmother would have wanted, for the truth to come out, for Thomas's story to be told, for the historical record to be corrected. He emphasized that while Grandma Rose could not have known about the photograph, her account corroborated everything Sarah had discovered. Jenkins had been at the Whitmore farm, he had been confined after trying to leave, and he had died under circumstances that the black community universally recognized as murder, regardless of what the white authorities claimed. As Sarah drove back to Nashville that evening, her car filled with photographs of the Turner family materials, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was grateful to have found this independent corroboration and to be able to give voice to Grandma Rose's testimony. But she was also angry and heartbroken that this history had been dismissed and ignored for so long, that Josephine Turner had been turned away when she tried to share these stories in the 1970s, that it had taken the accidental discovery of a hidden figure in a photograph to prompt serious investigation of what the black community had known all along. By December 2023, Sarah and Marcus had assembled a comprehensive case documenting Thomas Jenkins's life, his exploitation at the Whitmore farm, his imprisonment in the barn, and his death under circumstances that strongly suggested homicide rather than accident. They had the photograph with its haunting evidence of a man confined in the hayloft. They had official documents including the labor contract, newspaper accounts, court records, and the coroner's report. They had Grandma Rose's testimony, preserved in her own words by her family. They had expert analysis from forensic historians and legal scholars. Together, these materials told a story that was both specific to Jenkins and emblematic of the broader system of violence and exploitation that characterized the post-Reconstruction South. Sarah and Marcus decided it was time to make their findings public. They drafted a detailed research paper documenting their investigation and submitted it to the Journal of Southern History, one of the premier academic publications in the field. They also prepared a presentation for the Tennessee Historical Commission, hoping to have Jenkins's story included in the state's official historical records and potentially to have a historical marker placed at the site of the former Whitmore farm. Most importantly, they wanted to arrange for a proper memorial for Jenkins, a recognition that had been denied him for over 140 years. The research paper went through peer review and was accepted for publication in the spring 2024 issue. The reviewers praised the thorough documentation and the careful integration of multiple types of evidence. One reviewer noted that the photograph was among the most powerful pieces of historical evidence of post-Reconstruction labor exploitation ever discovered, and that its accidental nature made it even more significant. This was not a posed image created to document injustice, but rather an unintended capture of reality that slipped through despite the efforts of those who wanted such realities hidden. Sarah and Marcus also decided to reach out to the media, recognizing that academic publications alone would not bring Jenkins's story to the wide audience it deserved. They contacted several journalists who specialized in historical investigations and civil rights history. One reporter, Amanda Chin from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, expressed immediate interest. She had written extensively about racial violence in the post-Civil War South and saw Jenkins's story as an important addition to the growing body of work documenting this era's atrocities. Amanda traveled to Nashville in January 2024 to interview Sarah and Marcus and to photograph the historical documents and the barn photograph. She also made the trip to Kingsport to interview Michael Turner and his family, spending an entire day listening to their oral histories and photographing the notebooks containing Grandma Rose's testimony. Amanda's article, "The Man in the Hayloft," a Tennessee photograph reveals a hidden chapter of post-Reconstruction violence, was published in February 2024 and immediately attracted widespread attention. The article was detailed and powerful, combining Sarah and Marcus's scholarly research with the human dimension of Jenkins's story as preserved in the Turner family's oral history. Amanda included the photograph prominently, with the figure in the hayloft clearly marked and enhanced, ensuring that readers could see what had been hidden for so long. The article also provided historical context about labor exploitation in the 1880s South, explaining how legal mechanisms and extra-legal violence combined to create conditions that differed from slavery more in name than in substance. The response to Amanda's article was overwhelming. It was shared thousands of times on social media, picked up by other news outlets, and sparked conversations about historical memory, racial justice, and the importance of uncovering suppressed histories. Several descendants of other black families who had lived in Hawkins County during the 1880s reached out with their own family stories of exploitation and violence, suggesting that Jenkins's case was far from unique. The article also prompted uncomfortable conversations in Hawkins County itself, where some residents resisted the re-examination of their local history while others, particularly younger people and African American community members, embraced the opportunity to acknowledge and address past injustices. One unexpected development came in March 2024, when a woman named Patricia Whitmore Harrison contacted Sarah through the Tennessee State Archives. Patricia was a great-great-granddaughter of James Whitmore, living in Memphis and previously unaware of her ancestors' actions. She had seen Amanda's article and had been horrified to learn this history. Patricia wanted to meet with Sarah, Marcus, and Michael Turner to apologize on behalf of her family and to discuss how she might help ensure Jenkins's story was properly commemorated. The meeting took place at the Tennessee State Museum on a rainy afternoon in late March. It was emotionally charged, with Patricia clearly struggling with shame and grief over what her ancestor had done. She brought with her some additional Whitmore family materials she had discovered in her grandmother's attic, including a few letters and account books from the 1880s. While none explicitly mentioned Jenkins or his death, the materials did reveal James Whitmore to be a harsh, unforgiving man primarily concerned with profit and control, providing additional context for understanding his treatment of workers. Michael Turner was gracious and forgiving, explaining to Patricia that the burden of historical injustice should not fall on descendants but rather on the systems that enabled and protected such behavior. He emphasized that what mattered now was ensuring Jenkins was remembered, that the truth was acknowledged, and that contemporary society learned from this history. Patricia committed to supporting these goals, offering to fund a memorial and to use her position and connections to advocate for historical recognition. Sarah felt profound respect watching this encounter between descendants of the perpetrator and descendants of those who had preserved the victim's story. It represented a form of reconciliation that, while it could never undo past harms, at least acknowledged them and worked toward a more complete historical understanding. This was not about blame or guilt passed down through generations, but about choosing to face difficult truths and to honor those who had been wronged. By summer 2024, plans were underway for multiple forms of commemoration. The Tennessee Historical Commission approved the installation of a historical marker at the site of the former Whitmore farm. The marker's text, carefully drafted by Sarah and Marcus with input from Michael Turner and approved by the commission, told Jenkins's story directly and unflinchingly: his exploitation under a labor contract, his attempted escape and forced return, his imprisonment in the barn, and his death under circumstances the black community of the time recognized as murder. The marker acknowledged that the official ruling of accidental death was likely a cover-up and that Jenkins represented many black workers who suffered similar fates during this dark period of Tennessee history. A memorial service was planned for September 2024, timed to coincide with the anniversary of Jenkins's death. The service would take place at the historical marker site and would include readings from Grandma Rose's testimony, remarks from historians and community leaders, and a blessing of a memorial stone being placed to honor Jenkins's memory. Patricia Whitmore Harrison offered to cover all costs associated with the memorial and the service, viewing it as a small form of restitution for her ancestors' crimes. The most ambitious commemoration project involved creating a permanent exhibit at the Tennessee State Museum titled Hidden Figures: Uncovering Lost Stories of Tennessee's Past. The exhibit would feature the barn photograph prominently, along with detailed explanation of Sarah's investigation, the historical context of post-Reconstruction labor exploitation, and Jenkins's story as preserved in oral history. The exhibit would also include other photographs and documents revealing aspects of Tennessee history that had been suppressed or ignored, making the case that true historical understanding required confronting uncomfortable truths rather than preserving only celebratory narratives. Sarah spent much of the summer working with the museum's exhibition team, helping to develop interpretive text, selecting supporting materials, and ensuring that the exhibit treated Jenkins's story with appropriate respect and gravity. She was particularly insistent that Grandma Rose's words be featured prominently, that the Turner family's role in preserving this history be recognized, and that visitors understand the broader context of systematic racial violence and exploitation that made Jenkins's fate tragically common rather than exceptional. The exhibit, opening in October 2024, drew a large crowd, including many historians, journalists, and community members. Michael Turner and his family were there, along with Patricia Whitmore Harrison and several other Whitmore descendants who had contacted Sarah after the news coverage. The presence of both families, linked by tragedy across generations, sent a powerful message about the possibility of acknowledging painful histories while working toward understanding and reconciliation. During her remarks at the opening, Sarah reflected on the journey that had begun nearly a year earlier when she unrolled a seemingly ordinary photograph onto her conservation table. She spoke about the responsibility archivists and historians have to look beyond official narratives, to seek out suppressed voices, to examine evidence carefully even when it reveals truths that challenge comfortable historical understandings. She acknowledged that without the Turner family's preservation of oral history across generations, the true meaning of the photograph might never have been understood. Official documents alone told a story of legal contract enforcement and unfortunate accident. Only the voices of those who had lived through and witnessed these events revealed the truth of exploitation, imprisonment, and likely murder. Marcus spoke about the importance of the photograph as historical evidence. He explained that visual documentation from the post-Reconstruction era rarely captured the realities of black workers' lives, since photography was expensive and typically commissioned by wealthy white families to commemorate their success and respectability. The Whitmore barn photograph was extraordinary precisely because it accidentally documented what was meant to remain hidden. Jenkins's presence in the hayloft, captured by chance during a long exposure, provided proof that survived when so much other evidence was destroyed or suppressed. Michael Turner's remarks were the most moving. He spoke about his great-great-grandmother's determination to preserve these stories, about the burden black families carried in remembering truths that the dominant culture wanted forgotten, about the validation it brought to finally have these accounts recognized as legitimate historical evidence rather than dismissed as exaggeration or bias. He dedicated the exhibit to Grandma Rose's memory and to Thomas Jenkins, saying that while justice had been denied in their own time, the act of remembering and acknowledging was itself a form of delayed justice.